Hi, friends. Father Kerry here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on coronavirus, normalcy, and conversion. The coronavirus has hit the United States with a vengeance. In the last 3 weeks, we have seen infection and mortality rates exponentially rise, and there's no reason to think that there will be a slowdown in the near future. And this situation has created among all of us a great deal of anxiety and in some quarters even panic. I hear so many people say that they yearn for a return to normalcy before the pandemic hit us. I've said that myself. We want to get back to the normal way in which we lived our lives. We want to leave behind us this strange, abnormal social distancing that we have to practice now in order to stay healthy. This strangely abnormal, repetitious washing of our hands all the time. We want to get away from the abnormal need to cover our mouths at the slightest wheeze or cough or sneeze. And we especially want to get away from the abnormal refraining from touching our face. We want life to become normal again, don't we? I totally sympathize with that sentiment. But I think that we really ought to ask ourselves if we want to return to the normal as the normal was. Because I want to suggest to you that each of the 4 techniques that we're now encouraged to use in order to maintain our health have dark analogues in normal times. Whereas these 4 techniques are now intended to keep us healthy, the dark analogues of them in normal times corrupted our souls and corrupted culture as well. Let me explain what I mean. In this coronavirus pandemic, we are urged, aren't we, to socially distance ourselves from one another so that we don't infect others. But in normal times, didn't we also practice a kind of social distancing in which we maintained a lot of space between ourselves and anyone whom we consider to be disreputable? Isn't it the case that we divided society up into people who are proper and people who are improper? Isn't it the case that we marginalized entire groups of people, that we put distance between us and them, economic distance, moral distance, spiritual distance, and physical distance? Isn't it the case, my friends, that like the priest and the Levite who left the wounded man on the road to Jericho, that we too have bypassed those people who we should have been embracing as our fellow countrymen and women? That's a kind of social distance that we practiced in normal times. Do we really want to return to that? Or what about washing our hands? It seems odd now, doesn't it, even though it's intended to preserve our health? But didn't we wash our hands all the time in normal times? We wash our hands of responsibility for the injustices that we see around us. We say, I'm not responsible for that. I didn't do that personally, and what can I do about it anyway? Isn't it the case, my friends, that we declared ourselves innocent of any complicity in the injustices in society around us, just as Pilate washed his hands and declared himself innocent of complicity in the death of the Lord? Surely that's an aspect of normalcy that we don't want to return to. We find it a little odd, a little abnormal to have to cover our mouths constantly in order to keep ourselves healthy during this time. But didn't we cover our mouths all the time in normalcy by not speaking out when we should have, by not spreading the good news of Christ and Christ's salvation because we found it awkward socially to do so, or not speaking out when we encountered injustices in the world that should have been called out? Didn't we cover our mouths when we refused to speak truth to power and allow the injustices around us to go on uncriticized, unnoticed, unspoken by us? That's not a kind of normalcy we want to return to. And what about not touching our face? We find it extremely difficult in this day and age, even though it's intended to keep us healthy. But in normal times, didn't we also refrain from touching our face in the sense that we refuse to explore ourselves, to touch our genuine self, to self-reflect and to discover exactly what it is that we should want out of life, as opposed to what it is that we think is desirable in life? Didn't we refuse to make contact with our true self, the image of God within us, because we simply didn't want to be bothered by the demands that doing so might make upon us? If the only thing that we want to do in the midst of this horrible pandemic is to return to normalcy, my fear is that we'll take all of the bad things that we experienced and practiced before the pandemic into the post-pandemic period. And if that's the case, then nothing will have been learned from the coronavirus infestation. We will forget it as quickly as we can in order to get back to our normal lives. I think we would do well to pay attention to Lamentations, the Hebrew Testament book traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah, because it has, I think, a really valuable lesson to offer us about how to respond to the current crisis and how to deal with it after it passes. Lamentations is composed of 5 poems, each of them written immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Babylonians in the year 587 BC. And in those lamentations, you see the author expressing a range of emotions, from despair to rage to intense grief. But what makes these lamentations, as opposed to garden variety mourning, if you will, is that they also recognize that things have to change. They recognize that the suffering that the author is currently experiencing is a wake-up call, is an opportunity, is an invitation, if you will, not to return to normalcy, but to allow the experience of hardship and pain and suffering to midwife a conversion, a rethinking of the world, a new way of looking at the world, a new deep exploration of one's true self, as well as one's genuine relationship with God. If we return to normalcy after the coronavirus, it seems to me, we will have forsworn hope in a better future. If we use this horrible period to help us discern between what's really essential, what's really precious, what's really necessary in our lives, as opposed to all of the jetsam and flotsam that we might have been grasping on before the pandemic hit us, if we refuse to make that kind of self-analysis and to open ourselves to a new way of relating to one another and to God, then all of this will have been for very, very little. Lamentations tells us that there is always hope even in the darkest of times. Let me read just one passage that ought to, I think, inspire all of us. The author says this: "This I will call to mind, therefore I will hope. The Lord's acts of mercy are not exhausted. His compassion is not spent. They are renewed each morning." Each morning, God gives us an opportunity to reflect on who we are and to use that reflection as a means of reaching out to Him and reaching into our better selves. Let's not waste the opportunity, my friends, that the coronavirus is giving all of us. Let's truly use it as an invitation, as a vehicle for conversion. Let's not return to normalcy. This has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.